Good evening, everybody. My name is Drake Johnson. I'm a member of the RONU chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated.
And my name is Imani Weeks, and I am the Vice President of the Lambda Upsilon chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated.
Firstly, we want to thank you guys for all joining us today on this panel focusing on law and social justice, featuring alumni from both of our chapters. We are fortunate enough to have them here to share some of their experiences and advice with all of us today. We hope that everybody here is able to learn a little something and have the opportunity to ask questions they may have. So we are going to start off with the introductions of our panelists, followed by some questions we have prepared for today, and we'll end with a few questions from the audience who are watching from home.
So we'll start with Lambda Upsilon. Daria Rose was an undergraduate member of the lovely and uppermost Lambda Upsilon chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. She graduated from Harvard in 2019, where she studied government and women, gender, and sexuality. Daria is currently a rising 2L at Yale Law School, where she is a member of the Yale Law Journal and on the board of the Black Law Student Association. She has also helped create Yale's new pre-law program called Access to Law School for New Haven residents. This past summer, she spent her time at 2 law firms. Daria is originally from Long Island, New York. And then Eni Popoola is a second-year student at Columbia Law School. Born and raised in Queens, New York, Eni obtained her bachelor's degree from Harvard University in 2017 with a joint concentration in sociology and government. She then spent 2 years working as a 7th grade history and English teacher at a charter school in East Harlem. This past summer, she worked as a summer associate at the New York office of McCool Smith PC. As a first-year law student, she was an active member of the Black Law Student Association and Empowering Women of Color, the Women of Color Affinity Group. This year, she will serve as the secretary of BLSA, as well as a staff editor on the Columbia Law Review. Outside of law school, Eni enjoys finding the time to stay active, read, and run #AnyGivenSunday, her personal beauty and lifestyle blog.
And for the two panelists from the RONU chapter, Brother Etienne Toussaint is an assistant professor of law at the University of the District of Columbia's David A. Clark School of Law, where he teaches contracts, business organization, and additionally serves as co-director of their Community Development Law Clinic. Professor Toussaint began his legal career as a project finance associate with the international law firm Norton Rose Fulbright US LLP, and subsequently served as a law and policy fellow with the Poverty and Race Research Action Council in Washington, D.C. Professor Toussaint has a Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from MIT, a Master's of Science in Environmental Engineering from the Johns Hopkins University, a Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School, and a Master of Law from the George Washington University Law School. Professor Toussaint is a member of the RONU chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And Brother Kincaid. Brother Matthew Kincaid is the CEO of Overcoming Racism, LLC, an organization which seeks to develop more equitable institutions through comprehensive race and equity training to develop culturally responsive schools and practitioners in the workplace. As a former educator, instructional coach, school administrator, and activist, Matthew has been leading anti-racist workshops for over 15 years. He has been recognized as a top 100 visionary leader by Real Leaders magazine. In 2018, he was awarded Young Entrepreneur of the Year for the state of Louisiana. He's a graduate of Tufts University and a member of the RONU chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated.
Thank you to all our panelists. I just want to begin our question with, what inspired you to pursue your profession/sector in law?
Great, so I will go first. A lot of what inspired me to pursue law school in the first place stemmed from my undergraduate course load. So I vividly remember taking a class on urban sociology that I stumbled on by chance by a friend, who was like, Eni, you should come check out this class. And I was fascinated at how racism is embedded in literally the structures that are built. We spoke about, housing projects. We spoke about all different types of housing structures and how they are racist, essentially, and how they breed a lot of the institutions and a lot of the issues that we see in communities of color, specifically Black communities. And a lot of the time, it just kept coming back to the law for me. So ultimately, whether I was taking a class on, urban sociology or whether I was taking a class on the voting process, or how formerly incarcerated individuals don't have the right to vote in some states. Like all of that was very, very interesting to me. That coupled with some of the places that I spent my time as an undergrad. So I spent one summer at the New York Attorney General's office in the Civil Rights Bureau. And then something there that stuck out to me that I didn't really know too much about was the school to prison pipeline. And so that it basically was just a lot of courses, a lot of internship experience that led me to want to pursue law school. But I did take time off in between college and law school. One, to just get some work experience, and two, because I had experienced what I call academic fatigue, where I just really needed an opportunity to be in the real world and to experience firsthand some of the things that I hope to, change through being a lawyer. And teaching was that for me. And it really reignited a fire for me to want to come to law school. So that is the short, but not really short answer of why I decided to pursue law as a career.
All right, I'll go ahead, Etienne.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, I think for me, it was somewhat of an organic process. I actually, as the introductions alluded to, I started studying engineering. And I think ultimately the reason why is a passion for community development, a passion for thinking about how communities change and evolve over time. One of the great things about studying engineering at MIT in the time that I did, I had an opportunity to take classes in other departments. So I took political science courses, economics, and that really gave me an opportunity to see the interdisciplinary nature of community development work. In addition, through my participation in Alpha Phi Alpha and other organizations, I had a chance to step into the community and to see the need for community development, the need for racial justice work in particular. And so I think that inspired me to think about the intersection of engineering, technology, and policy work and law. And so from that, even transitioning to graduate school, I continue to think about ways to engage policymaking, ways to engage the law and the evolution of law. And I think ultimately, saw law school as an opportunity to marry those interests. And then, of course, in law school, had an opportunity to just dig deeper in understanding the way the law and understanding how policymakers impact issues on the ground, impact communities of color, low-income communities, marginalized communities, and ultimately communities very much like the one that I grew up in. And so I think for me, that was really the driving force and continues to drive the work that I do today.
So I'll go next. Mine is a bit different from the other two panelists. I was one of those kids growing up where they're like, that kid should be a lawyer. And I was like, that's exactly what I want to do. My mom was a lawyer. So I kind of grew up seeing what she did and helping our community and, working in housing and really, just being my role model and someone that I looked up to. And then I lost my home during my sophomore year of high school. So going into college, I really started looking into housing and looking into what it takes and the laws behind it even more. And I took surveyed some classes over at the Harvard Law School, and I loved it. And I talked to a lot of professors, and that's really what inspired my decision. So I think I've always known that I've wanted to be a lawyer and I wanted to go into the law. So that's also why I went straight through. So I graduated from Harvard not too long ago, and a lot of people watching this panel might be really close in age to me. So, I knew that it was what I wanted to do, and that's why I just went for it.
Awesome. First, I'm very humbled to be on a panel with all the folks who are here. Very impressive and very inspiring people. I think, I tell most people, I led my first anti-racism intensive when I was 14. I think that very few people who are doing genuine anti-racism work choose it. I think it's the type of work that kind of chooses you. So I oftentimes think about what I would be doing if systemic racism didn't exist, and if I were able to, operate in a society where these intersecting systems of oppression didn't impact my lived experience. So I've, recognizing injustice both in my community and seeing the differences between the school that I went to and the community I came from, and can seeing those injustices persist through high school and college, and moving to New Orleans where I became a teacher. I also taught social studies. That's why I gave you the big up for that. Yeah, and then just looking at my students who were doing everything they needed to do to be successful, but face significant obstacles outside of school, they were oftentimes reified inside of school. So I found Overcoming Racism to think about what does it mean to envision and actualize anti-racist change. But it feels more like a calling than something that I want to do. I'm actually a big disappointment to my mom because she wanted me to be a lawyer. So maybe y'all can rub off on me a little bit. When I first started my company, my mom was like, it's not too late to go to law school. But I think she gets it now. So yeah, so it's just something I've always done.
And so we're curious about, for those of us who went to law school, kind of that process, navigating and picking a law school, and then also preparing for the LSAT. And then Brother Kincaid, that your experience transitioning from, how you made that decision to go into education first, and then transitioning from education into being an entrepreneur, if you can explore more about that.
So the process of picking a school for me was, I guess, more, I don't know. For me, there were certain things that I kept in mind that were personal to me. I feel like contrary to the college process for me, like Harvard was the goal, that was where I wanted to go. And, thank God it happened, but going to law school just alleviated a lot of that pressure. So it allowed me to just look at schools that were truly what I was interested in. A big thing for me, I'm from New York. I wanted to go to school in New York. I wanted to be close to family because I knew law school was going to be a very challenging time, and at least being able to see family would be important to me. Being able to be, like, being from New York is very important to me. So being able to be in my community or in that community was very important. So in that regard, I was very focused on looking at schools that were in New York. Did I apply to schools outside of New York? Of course, always keeping my options open, but like geographic region was important to me, not only just because of how I wanted to feel, but also for options for once I graduated law school. If I wanted to stay in New York, being in New York already would make it easier. Things like the LSAT, the LSAT is a very interesting test. I to be transparent, struggled with it a lot more than I struggled with, say, for example, the SAT. It was very straightforward. The SAT for me was just, study and keep studying. And then I did well. And the LSAT was like, I studied, it didn't work. I took a class, it sort of didn't work. It never really worked because I always got test day anxiety, which I never really experienced until the LSAT. So in that regard, it was it was a humbling experience for me because it was something that I never really thought I figured out truly, but it just also speaks to other areas of an application that are helpful, such as, any work experience, such as your GPA, such as your personal statement, which I think are things that we might touch on later. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I can speak to this very briefly. I think most people, the first thing that comes to mind is prestige. And so I'll just put that out there. I think most people, when they think about law school, immediately think about, what's the highest quote unquote ranked school that I can get into. And I think, for better or for worse, the legal industry is still one that is, not merely not diverse, but it's also very much driven by the sort of quote unquote prestige. So I think that to some degree is a factor that many people take into account, and they try to get into the best school, based on these standard metrics of measurement as they can. But once you get past that, I do think that there are other things that students should keep in mind. I think first is the curriculum and the sort of orientation of the program itself. I think there are some schools that are, very focused on a certain political orientation. There are other schools that are more progressive. There are some schools that emphasize clinical training, et cetera. And so I think those are certainly things that you should think about. If you're interested in environmental law, you should think about whether there might be opportunities for you to do substantive work in that area, look at the professors that are teaching there and what kinds of courses are being offered. If you're interested in critical race theory, that's not something that's taught at every school. And there's certainly some professors that specialize in those subjects. So that's also, those kinds of things should drive your decision-making. I think the second category I'd say is location and the alumni network. Ultimately, you're going to practice law, and certainly some schools give you access to a broader market. But most schools, their strength is their location and their access to a local alumni network. So really thinking about where you want to practice law after you graduate and how that connects to the various schools that you're looking at. And then finally, with respect to the LSAT, I'm one of those kids that never took a class, so to speak. And I probably could have saved up for an LSAT class, but at that point in my life, I was sort of convinced that I could do it on my own, for better or for worse. But I don't think it's impossible. I think ultimately, like any standardized test, the way to be successful is just, rigorous practice. It's one of those exams similar to the SAT and the GRE, that the more you practice, the more you begin to see patterns and trends and understand the test itself. And to some degree, the LSAT is not really testing your understanding of law. I mean, it's not testing any understanding of law. And it's not testing your ability to be successful in law school. It's simply testing your ability to be successful at the LSAT. And so there are many books, there are many practice exams that you can purchase and dedicate time to getting better at taking that exam. And it's the same thing is true for all other standardized tests, maybe with the exception of the MCAT, where you do need some substantive training and physics and biology and other courses to be successful.
So I applied to 15 schools in total. I pretty much blanketed the T14. As Brother Toussaint has kind of alluded to, there is a big culture in law around prestige and elitism and ranking. So that was sort of my mindset going in, for better or worse. And I swapped out a couple of schools based on, location. I don't want to really repeat what my other panelists have said, but something else I think that I thought a lot about was fit. So after I got into my schools, I went and I visited them, because I feel like that's really the only true way that you can figure out whether I belong here. Like, sit around, walk around on the campus, or, just talking to people and like seeing what their reactions are. A lot of times people are hesitant to say, bad things about their school, but you can kind of read between the lines to get a sense of how they really feel about it. I really loved Harvard when I visited it, but I was already an undergrad there. And because I was going straight through, I really wanted a different experience. When I came to Yale, I absolutely loved it. I had thought about going to Yale in undergrad. It's also a small school. That's something you should think about too, is the size of your school. In comparison, like Columbia and Harvard are, a lot bigger, on the bigger side. So yeah, I visited Yale. I really liked it. And then I learned more about the differences between the schools in the T14. And Yale, for example, we don't have grades our first semester. And that was a big selling point for me. And I was like, sign me up, I'm in. And then the last thing I'll say is I'll briefly touch on loans. Yale has a great loan repayment program. So if you leave school and you decide you want to be in, the government public sector service, most schools, well, not most, but a lot of the top schools will have some form of loan repayment where they give you a check for the month to pay your loans because you're not making that much, but you're doing public service work. Yale's is a bit different in that it doesn't matter what you're doing, as long as you're making below a certain threshold, you will qualify for their loan repayment program. And that was really important to me, because I wanted to leave all my options open in case I, don't go into big law and want to make a lot of money. If I decide to completely do something else, which is actually typical at Yale, a lot of people come here and they don't want to be a lawyer. I have the freedom and optionality to do that without being scared and saddled by all the debt. And then on the LSAT point, I think my experience was a lot like Eni's, that, I felt like I studied and studied and studied, and like it worked somewhat, didn't really work. I took the LSAT twice, and I would not want to take it ever again. It wasn't a great experience. But that's not all there is to an application. And I think that admissions officers know that, and they see that, especially for minority applicants. There's so much about the LSAT and its inherent racism, more so than any other test out there. And that's a whole nother topic for another day. But, there's more to you than just that score. But you should still study really hard and try.
I believe my question was how I transitioned from being an educator to being an entrepreneur, correct? Yes. Thank you all for all of your answers as well. Definitely learned a lot about applying to law school if I ever choose to make my mother proud of me and go ahead and do it. Although this LSAT, you all scared me away a little bit. Once again, similar to my first answer, I think I transitioned to entrepreneurship more out of necessity than anything else. As I mentioned, at my school in New Orleans, we were 99% Black. I think 94 to 95% of our students were living below the poverty line. And, when I moved into leadership into the school, we trained all the teachers in anti-racist practices, which I have been doing, for many years. Wasn't just me, obviously, but myself, along with a collaborative of teachers. And then, shifted some policies, and we had dramatic results. We almost eliminated suspensions. Our school performance score academically rose an entire letter grade, which, a lot of times people would see those things like on an inverse type of thing, where it's like, oh, well, if you're gonna, invest in restorative practice and you're not suspending kids, then like, what about the grades? Which I just think is not very smart, because we know the suspensions and expulsions are just interventions in schools that don't work. And so when shocker, when you don't put kids out of school very many days, they learn more and they do better on the state tests and whatever other assessments the state cares about. So New Orleans is a small city, very unique history in New Orleans in terms of education. Really briefly, after Hurricane Katrina, which the anniversary of that was yesterday, 15 years ago, the school structure in New Orleans completely changed. Prior to the storm, there were 500 students in charter schools. After the storm, the city was rapidly on the pace of completely replacing traditional public schools with charter. New Orleans is now the only city in the country that's 100% charter, which is, once again, similar to the LSAT, a whole nother panel conversation. However, word spread pretty fast about the results that we had. I started working with some schools across the city, and then realizing that, I had something that people needed, and wanted to expand that influence to as many schools and as many educators as I could. I had this wonderful 2-year plan. I was going to reduce my leadership role, go back into the classroom, teach a social justice course, and then on the side, do the consulting. And then after meeting with the chief academic officer, where he said a lot of the things that you would think I would have wanted to hear in that moment, something in my spirit said that there was an alignment with the district that I was working in my total goal of anti-racism. And I just stopped. I didn't have any clients. Oh, I had clients, but I didn't have any signed contracts for the next year. I had no guaranteed income, no healthcare, no nothing. I just decided I would pursue it full time and took the leap. Luckily it worked out for me, and our organization is doing really well, and we've never struggled significantly financially. And I think that, any form of entrepreneurship includes risk. And so if you're interested in entrepreneurship, you have to take risk, but I'm not saying necessarily follow my path, right? I mean, there are a lot of different variables that worked out that helped the eventual success of overcoming racism.
And then kind of shifting that focus, I know some of you guys already touched on this earlier, but how has your racial identity impacted your experience, your career field? And if there were any particular challenges that you wanted to touch on / describe, and how you overcame them?
I will answer the question at least geared specifically towards my law school experience. So how has race impacted my experience as a law student, as a first-year law student? For anyone, sorry about the sirens, New York City. For anyone who is familiar, if you're not familiar, the first-year law curriculum is pretty much set for you. So you take your standard classes, contracts, property, or criminal law, constitutional law, etc. And in some cases, and there a lot of times as first-year students, we got the idea that some people thought that the system or the way that it was taught, which was through the casebook method, was often outdated or problematic, whatever. That's also a topic for another day. But so there were definitely times where it was very clear in the classroom that professors in general could have done better in terms of making the classroom a more comfortable or more welcoming place, or for Black students, for students of color. Particularly, I think about, criminal law, my criminal law class, and how often race just wasn't addressed. And the most stark example for me was reading about a case that was in New York where, a man, after I had looked it up, when I was reading it, I thought to myself, there's no way, like, I know this case has to be a situation where it was a white man who shot 4 Black teenagers on a subway. And once I looked it up, it was a subway vigilante, etc. But, the casebook didn't mention that the fact that there was this racial component. And in class, we didn't really mention it either. It was just to talk about, I don't even remember what it was at the time. It might have been something about attempt or premeditation or something like that. And as a student, you're sitting there and you're thinking like, wow, we're really not going to talk about the big elephant in the room. And as a Black student, you're thinking probably the only people who are thinking about this, as opposed to whatever the professor is saying right now, are the Black students. So there's always that, situation where you're balancing what the professor wants you to study, what they want you to learn, but you're also balancing a lot of the thoughts you're having about what we're not discussing, or how other students who also want to be lawyers, who are going to be your colleagues, who are going to go on to be, everything that these law schools say that people are going to go on to be, but we're not even from day one as a first-year law student having these conversations about how race impacts our view of the world, our view of the law, etc. So, I mean, this past summer definitely gave an opportunity for us to apply more pressure to these law schools. But, sometimes I'm a little bit skeptical because, we're only here for 3 years, and then it quickly turns over, and then there's a new batch of students who are asking for the same things. But it's, especially within the law school curriculum, it's always something that's on my mind. And then on top of that, it's always on my mind in terms of the work that I go on to do, or the firms that I work at, or the pro bono work that I do, or the clinics that I sign on for. So my answer is kind of all over the place because I have many thoughts on it. But the short answer is race is always playing a role in my experience as a law student, and probably in my experience as a lawyer.
I'll get mine out of the way. Yeah, I think, I'd like to think about this question through more of an intersectional lens, because I definitely can tell you numerous stories, both as a teacher and as an entrepreneur, where race has had an adverse impact on my experience. But I also think that, particularly as an entrepreneur, I've seen a lot of doors open that I can attribute to the fact that I'm a man and that I'm a cisgender man. And so, when I talk about I think there's always that imposter syndrome that comes in when it comes into play with race. Like, I just, I look at some of the white people who are even in this field of anti-racism and how much they're able to charge, whether it be Robin DiAngelo or Tim Wise, and they're charging $30,000, $40,000 a session, crazy stuff. And I'm clearly not charging those types of numbers. But at the same time, I've counseled some of my friends who are women of color, who are in a very similar field as me, and we've compared our prices and compared notes and talked about negotiations. And as a man, it's easy for me to be like, oh, well, you should raise your prices because you're being underpaid. But the ways in which a negotiation, a budget negotiation with a client may go, can be completely different just based on the fact that I'm a man and it's a woman. So, I try to acknowledge the fact that systemic racism certainly can be a impediment. I think in particular, one of the reasons I love teaching, I don't think I really desired to leave a school. However, I founded my own company because in the district that was run by white people, 3 years prior to founding the company, maybe 4 years, I took them effectively. What the business plan was like, yo, y'all need to hire somebody to do anti-racism work and training across the staff. It's all white, majority, if not all white leadership. At that time, the entire academics team was white. Most of the principals across the city were white. Y'all are serving almost exclusively Black children. It doesn't have to be me, but somebody should be doing this job. And it's funny because had they have offered me the job at that time, I would have taken that job for probably very little money, right? And very little prestige, and built a bunch of content and curriculum and things like that for the organization that now I own. So I always push people of color where if, a white person says, no, you can't do something that you know is in the best interest of your community. If that door is closed, I just like made my own door and walked through it. But I just want to acknowledge the ways in which male privilege also played a part in that, in the risk that I was able to take, that I don't think women of color are oftentimes able to take the same amount of risk in entrepreneurship, because they oftentimes don't receive the same amount of support.
So yeah, I mean, I echoing everything that Eni said, reading things in your casebook, just the experience of not talking about race in the classroom can be triggering. I'll take it from a different angle. I think also, though, my Black identity in law school it's really, I don't know, it's been illuminating in a way that I think that BALSA and a lot of the organizations that I'm able to garner support from is so strong. The Black professors that we do have at Yale Law School are very intentional about making connections with the Black students. So whether it be we're going over the professor's house for dinner to just, sit there and talk, whether they're like, come into office hours so we can, just chop it up and I can tell you things. I think that's been a really vital part of my experience. But there are the other factors at play that come with both being, like a first generation person at Yale Law School who's never, experienced this kind of like elitism on a different level of Ivy League scale. There's certain information networks that you don't know. There's a lot of people here whose dads or moms are senators or professors, and, things that kind of go unspoken. There's like clerkships, jobs, just a lot of factors that, being a Black law student who doesn't come from, a really strong Ivy League background that you wouldn't know. So I think that BALSA and other organizations help to sort of supplement that and provide support. But it can be a lonely experience if you don't have that, if you're looking out at the context of the world where there's only 5% of lawyers are, Black men and women. Even worse when you go into you look at partnership levels and, what those Black men and women are, doing. So I really think that, it can be both disheartening, but I've learned to find solidarity in the people that I've worked with here.
So it's an immensely big and deep question. And I think you could approach it, from an institutional level. You could talk about the industry of law itself or the institution of legal education itself, and disentangle the ways in which race and law are deeply intertwined and have been since the foundation of our country. I think many of us are familiar with that history. And I certainly empathize, with my other colleagues, especially those in law school who have talked about the frustrations of learning a legal discourse that sort of silences the issues of race. And we see it in law practice as well. There's historically been a yearning to avoid race, right? This notion of race neutrality in not only legal discourse, but in the ways we interpret the Constitution itself. That idea is viewed as sort of a goal, if you will. And so there's a sense, and we heard this even during, President Obama's election and presidency, there's a sense in which folks think that we need to transcend race or move beyond race. For me, as I think about the law and the work that I do in law, but also about how race impacts me as a lawyer and a law professor personally, my view is that it's an embracing Blackness or embracing the identity that, you bear as a racialized other, that as a country, right, we can begin to transcend the issues of race and how it's embedded in the practice of law. And I can just, for me personally, I think what that looked like was trying to struggle, right, with the way race impacted my experience as a law student, my experience as a lawyer. And I can certainly talk about, how those experiences probably reflect, stereotypical narratives of, the sole person here, or the, the stereotyped, individual there. But I think also I've tried to take advantage of opportunities to engage in solidarity with other individuals who share that experience. So, for example, in law school, I got involved in the Black Law Students Association, and then I joined the board of the National Black Law Students Association, and directed the international negotiations competition. And it's quite interesting when at certain schools, right, especially elite schools, those endeavors seem, are shunned or are not viewed as prestigious or as noteworthy as others, like joining law review. But I've always made an effort to engage with organizations that seek to uplift issues that impact communities of color, not only because it benefits me personally, but I think ultimately it will benefit our country. And so when I was a practicing attorney, I did a fair number of pro bono work, in the local community. I also mentored. And so I think it's really, really important, especially folks who are interested in the practice of law, a space that is not very diverse, to continue to hold fast to, their Blackness, for lack of another word, and to appreciate the Black, the Black freedom struggle that they are a part of, this radical tradition of continuing to push for progressive reform in the midst of institutional forces that subjugate Black and brown people. And to do that anywhere you are, whether that's at a firm or, at a nonprofit or public interest organization, or if you're an entrepreneur, such as Matthew Kincaid, there are ways to do the work of law, which you don't need a JD to do the work of law, but there's ways to advance legal reform while embracing Blackness. And so I think that's, for me, why my perspective on race in this field.
I think that really beautifully leads into our next question. And what we really want to hear, maybe if you guys can share some of how you've been able to, help or aid the Black community, and also giving advice to people who are looking to, economically uplift low-income and or working class communities. If you have any more advice on that end as well.
So how I've been able to aid the Black community, that sounds like very lofty. As a law student, well, I mean, even in ways, I think it started for me even before I came to law school. I mentioned earlier that I was a teacher, and that was a huge part of the reason that I decided to come to law school, honestly, because a lot of what I was seeing at my school, at the school that I taught at, was very problematic and outright racist, like, just to fully tell you. But I was very grateful to be a Black person, a Black woman teaching a lot of those students. I taught 7th grade. And just the way that parents' faces lit up when we had our beginning of school year meetings, like, oh, like, she's gonna look out for us, or she's like, we can trust her. In that way was very important to me. And then being able to teach history, which, although the school had a number of issues, the history curriculum was slightly better or more progressive than what I had expected. But then also being able to be real with students about what we were learning and what we were discussing. So those 2 years that I spent in my teaching 7th grade history and English, I think was a way for me to give back to a community. But I also gained a lot. Like, a lot of times we talk about giving back, but that was also like, I received a lot from that experience as well. In law school, Columbia has a very interesting history, a relationship to Harlem, to Morningside Heights. And a lot of times it's very easy for people to come plop themselves in Morningside Heights in the Columbia bubble and ignore how Columbia has created a lot of the issues that we have in the community. And a lot of those conversations came up once again when there was an unfortunate murder killing that happened in Morningside Heights earlier this past year. And so for me, what that looks like is, being able to still stay engaged with the community, whether it's through a lot of the community service initiatives that BOLSA has, but also being a community citizen. So still going to meetings that are happening in the community, still maintaining an active watch on things like the Manhattan DA and who is going to be representing. I'm originally from Queens, but now, living here, I'm in Harlem, so it's very important to keep that in mind and to still maintain active ties with the community, even though I am here as a student. I'm also here as someone who is trying to become a lawyer, who is trying to still look out for a lot of, for the community in that regard.
I can briefly say, I think being excellent wherever you find yourself advances racial justice, because it disrupts and dismantles the racist narratives that we've all grown up hearing. So I think in any capacity that you do legal work, just being excellent and being the best embodiment of who you are, I think is a great service. But certainly, as has been suggested, there are ways to dig deeper and do work that uplifts the community in a meaningful way. And in the very preamble of the rules of professional conduct for lawyers is a calling for attorneys to be public citizens. And so I think all lawyers must embrace this calling to uplift the community where they reside. I think it's very easy, once you graduate from law school, once you start to work at maybe a law firm, it's very easy to wall yourself off within a bubble, within a certain class, right? Because we know lawyers tend to earn more money than the average, citizens in their community. And it's very, very easy to sort of forget about the incredible opportunity that lawyers have to make an impact in a variety of different ways, whether that's pro bono work, whether it's mentoring, whether it is participating in panels such as this. I think there are lots of opportunities to give back, and I think that's a critical sort of calling that all lawyers, but particularly lawyers of color, need to embrace.
So I can go next. I think one of my main strengths is admissions. In high school, I was like that kid that got into all the Ivies, like come and, take their picture. And then in college, it was sort of similar with the process of law school admissions. And I think 3 weeks before I graduated, I sent an email out to all the listservs of the Black Students Association, the African Students Association, all of the Women's Association, everyone that I could think of. And I told them, hey, come and sit with me. And if you want to talk about law school, I'm here. And I think I had over 40 meetings in the dining hall, back to back to back to back, talking about admissions with people. And, I'm passionate about that and doing it for free. So when I came to law school, that was still something very much on my mind. And this wonderful Professor James Foreman, he is a Pulitzer Prize winner, Black, amazing, amazing human being, had an idea to start a program for New Haven residents to help them get into law school. Similar to what Eni is saying, Yale's relationship with the New Haven community is very tenuous. It's a long history. It's a strained history. When you have a primarily and predominantly Black and brown community, and you place a very elite white institution right in the middle of that, there's bound to be some tension. So this was a part of Yale's project to give back to New Haven. So I spent my entire summer doing that, creating that, picking the fellows. It's 20 fellows. They are all amazing. 5 of them are formerly incarcerated. All from the New Haven area. And, it's not just about getting them into law school, but, supporting them beyond that. And then the hope is that they'll come back into the New Haven community and, use what they have learned and, organized through their time in law school and their time after to uplift and build New Haven, because the more I'm here, the more I realize it's a great city. And then I guess your second question kind of was about how do you think that, how can students listening to this, help their community? I think knowing your strengths. I know admissions is my strength. If anyone listening to this wants to reach out to me personally, I'm happy to help you with it. And knowing your strengths and trying to use those and those God-given talents and abilities to help other people. It doesn't have to be something large, like Kincaid starting an organization, which is absolutely amazing, but individually on a small level, like each person that you help makes a ripple effect and a huge difference. And I'm here only because people older than me, helped me through the process. So I want to give that back.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I hope our work is helping the Black community. Is kind of the main thrust of what we do. It's kind of the only focal point is if we can help. I mean, obviously all communities of color and really everybody, because any white supremacy benefits all of us except for, say, the handful of billionaires that run the country. So, I think one of the things that's really important to think about is a lot of times, especially all of us in some way, shape, or form, like are here because we went to some elite, predominantly white, or I like to call historically white institution, right? And so I think a lot of times, our families are very proud of us, the community is very proud of us. Like, you've made it to the table, you have a seat at the table. But the question is, like, are we just taking another seat? Are we pulling up another chair alongside us? Kind of like Daria spoke about with this fellows program. But additionally, like, are we also helping to flip the table? Because we know that the ways in which these rooms and these levels of access were constructed were unfair in the first place. I have a ton of stories of that that, I won't waste your time with now. Hopefully, you all give our contact information out, email, website, social media. People can certainly reach out to me. But one of the things I think is really important for me is just like demystifying entrepreneurship. I talk to young people about entrepreneurship a lot. I help friends who are starting companies. I literally was like designing logos and building a website. It was my way of procrastinating from the work I have for a friend who was like, I think this needs a push. I was like, yo, here's a website. It's horrible. I don't do web design, but it's a website. Like, you can do it. And the reason why I say that is because, like, even those of us who were, bright young Black kids who fit within the system really well and were able to navigate it to get to these elite institutions, like, people say, you can be anything, you can be the president, you can da-da-da. Like, no one ever in my entire life told me I could be an entrepreneur. And I think that when we think about, breaking generational curses and closing the wealth gap, one of the major vehicles we can do that is through entrepreneurship. I mean, I think in terms of our work, obviously we're, not just doing anti-racism trainings where we fly in, fly out, make people cry and say kumbaya and everyone feels better. We force our clients to work with us for at least a year. We're auditing their system and structures, discipline practices, curriculum, hiring practices, family and community engagement structures. We're helping organizations draft anti-racism statements. All of us went to school in Boston at one point in time. We're now working with the entire state of Massachusetts education department. And so we're training every single leader across the entire state in anti-racism and also auditing some of the systems that exist there. And so you think about like engagements like that. I mean, think about the ripple effect for children when every single person who's in a leadership position is being trained in best practices around anti-racism. And we're literally helping to write hiring policies and discipline policies and curricular-based policies and really trying to push people to disrupt the system. I think the impact can be pretty significant. So that's the main thrust of it. But I think on the side, we donate a lot of money to community-based organizations. We do mentorship and all that other stuff. But the thing I've surprisingly been most passionate about from starting this company is like every Black person should and can be an entrepreneur in some capacity. And this isn't the whole like, start an LLC with your stimulus check. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that like, there's so much ingenuity in our communities. And if we bank resources and support one another, then some of those skills and talents that we give to other corporations for them to in turn pay us less than we're worth and to treat us less than what we're worth based on systemic racism, how can we support this entrepreneurship core? The data is suggesting that after the pandemic, 40% of Black-owned businesses will not return. That's harrowing, right? And so how can we not just think about, impacting in our sectors through, working in other places, but how can we think about rebuilding the entrepreneurial core that it's always been a part of the Black experience?
Thank you guys so much, especially for all this insight. In these last 10 minutes or so, I think we can shift into audience questions. I know the first one we have is, how did you navigate student loans / paying for law school?
Navigating, well, I mean, I'm not done with law school, but the reality is I have to take out loans to pay for law school. Harvard undergrad had a really good financial aid system, so I'm grateful I didn't graduate with any debt, which made it a little easier to just bite the bullet of the fact that I would have to take out loans. But so navigating that was, it was the run of the mill, financial aid and taking out loans, but it also just required a lot of thinking through what my options post law school would have to look like if I didn't want to work in public service, like Daria mentioned. Similarly, Columbia has a really good loan repayment program if you decide to not to go into public interest work. So that's the only difference. But thinking about, if I have these loans, if I have to take out loans, will I be able to pay them off? Will there be job options, or will I be in a position where I'm able to pay them off? I wish I could offer more about my process, but I'm still like in the midst of it. So check back in some years to see how long it takes to pay off. But financial aid for law school, I will say, is like it's different from college, especially if you went to an elite institution for undergrad. It probably is less than what you might expect from these types of schools. But I was, I guess, pleasantly surprised at how much they gave. But I think this ties back to trying to aim as high as possible on the LSAT. And if you're currently in college, just really focusing on your GPA. I would say that's like the biggest and most consequential thing that you can work on right now if you're still in college, to make it easier for you, because a high LSAT, high GPA, it's not everything, but it can open doors in terms of scholarships and extra money. So that would be my advice based on the process for me.
Yeah, I think that pretty much answers it. I think we should probably take another question, if there is one. If not, I can speak to that too.
Yeah, we have another question. This one is a bit long. There's two pieces to it. And the first question is going to be a little bit more tailored to the law kind of profession. In a profession designed to uphold and defend the law, particularly as it relates to litigation, how do you uphold or maintain justice in areas which perhaps the law fails or seems to fail? Which I think is a very loaded question. So in a profession, right, that's based around protecting the law, how do you keep justice where, the law may be failing to hold justice? And then the second part of the question, which everybody I think is able to kind of touch on, is, are there some things in your view that only can be changed by legislators in policy? Or I think that this gets into the activism and organizing piece that Brother Kincaid might be able to speak on as well.
I could get us started and others could jump in. I mean, it's a great question and it's a very complex question. I think certainly it's important to remember, and most, know this, that the law is a social construct. And so, while we operate within a legal system, it's important to remember that this system is constructed and it can be changed, it can be reformed, it can evolve. And in fact, even in our lifetime, we've seen laws evolve and change, right? We have same-sex marriage where, when many of us were born, that was not the case. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind. And certainly part of the work of legal advocates or social justice advocates more generally, right? Even those who do not have a law degree. I think certainly some of the work is operating within the parameters of law to try to reform law and push law to a more just articulation of the American democratic project. But to the point of activism, I think that also speaks to the very origins of our country, right? A sense in which law is sometimes something that needs to be toppled altogether. And, to be sure, our country was also founded on this deep sensibility about Black white supremacy. But but also this idea of a revolution, right? I think is an important historical artifact that is not only true of America, but our our society more generally. We see this in other countries as well. So I think there's a sense in which the voice of the people, in protest, is also a part of democracy at work and a part of law reform. And so as lawyers, you can be engaged in public protest and in activism in various ways outside of the courtroom. As non-lawyers, you can do that as well. And you can also be engaged in quote unquote public protest in the courtroom as well, right? By being creative about how you use law to push back against these systems that we know are really entrenched and sort of circumscribe our lives and define how we interact with one another. So, I think it's a complex question, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks, both in the law and outside of the law, to change the way our world looks. And now more than ever, it's so needed, in an age of Trump and in an age where, COVID is drastically changing how we interact with one another. I think it's a right time to push against the boundaries of what society looks like and how law shapes how society operates.
You want me to answer the other question? I don't know. I'll try to answer it in 30 seconds or less. The first thing I'll say is that policy, at least historically, perceives racist ideas. A lot of times people think that the goal of ending racism is we can convince every person to be anti-racist, or if, over time, people's personal ideologies loosen on their dependence upon racist ideas, that one day racism will just poof and go away. But in reality, like racist ideas, eliminating racist ideas has never been a precondition to eliminating racism. I don't care if somebody dislikes me because of the color of my skin. I care about the power and the institutions and the ways in which a person is able to act on their dislike of me based on the color of my skin, and how that is backed up by institutional and structural outcomes. And so, yeah, I think that obviously protest, revolt, all those different pieces go into policy change. But if we want to make serious change in this country, it actually does have to start at the policy level. And sure, you have to change hearts and minds in order for people to engage with the work that needs to be done to make the policy shift in this country. But when we reduce the racist policies, that should reduce racial disparities, and that will reduce our dependence upon racist ideas.
And then finally, as we end today, I just want to, do you guys have any career advice for students listening today, especially in the midst of the pandemic, with any opportunities you know of, or even classes that they can take online? If anybody wants to jump in.
Yeah, I guess I'll plug a couple of things for people, assuming that they're listening and they want to go to law school, and that's why they're listening to this. Okay, so first up is the Harvard Law Admissions Dean and the Yale Law Admissions Dean, Miriam Ingber, have started a podcast called Law School Admissions, something like that. You can go on Yale Law School's website and you'll find the new podcast. It starts sometime in August. They'll be doing about 10 episodes about demystifying the law school process, talking about all the things that you need and the components of your application. And this is really designed because usually they would be doing road shows and road tours to go out there, but they can't because of COVID. So I think it's great. Everyone has access to it. You can watch it on your own time. And I would totally recommend that. The second thing, not necessarily COVID related, but if you are in the process of applying, I would suggest, maybe looking up on forums and, reading them. Reddit is a really good source of information. Sometimes not everything in Reddit is correct, so take it with a grain of salt, but if you can sift through some of the craziness, you will find great pieces of information, and that's on our LSAT and our law school admissions. And then lastly, general advice during this pandemic, it's hard for everyone. Additionally, with the racial climate, take some time for yourself, take care of yourself. Self-care is incredibly important. This law school process can be demoralizing. It can be depersonalizing, you feel like you're just a number or your GPA. And I'm really here to tell you that that's just not it. There's so many components to you, and you can let them shine in many ways, whether it's your recommenders, your personal statement, your diversity statement, which I guess another tip, write all of the statements that they ask you to do, write them all. And yeah, just remain true to yourself during this process, as hard as that may be, and try not to compare yourself to others, and show up when you can, whether it be over Zoom or someone asks you to have a coffee chat or do a phone call. Just do it. Just try to be there as much as you possibly can. And again, I'm always open for emails or calls or anything you may need. And I think Imani will share my information after this. So feel free to reach out. And thank you guys for listening.
I just wanted to briefly echo that as someone who has sat on admissions committees for a law school. Certainly personality is incredibly important. And so to the extent that you can share your unique personality in your essays, in your resume that highlights the activities that you care about, I think that's really, really important. The final point that I'll make, and I think Matthew will appreciate this, is I think in this age of COVID, it is incredibly important to be entrepreneurial. I think it's not enough to simply sign up for the activities that are readily available or that you find through a quick online search. But I think it's important to create your opportunities. And in an age where everyone is virtual and remote, I think it's actually an opportunity to do so, right? You can reach out to various organizations and offer to support them virtually as a virtual intern. You can reach out to individuals and have virtual coffee chats, right? So you no longer have to meet people at Starbucks, but you can have a coffee chat on Zoom, and you can really take advantage of the opportunity to engage with your interests in various ways in an environment where it's not expected for you to be there in person. So I think, there's always a blessing in the curse, if you will. And so I think, as a student, as an applicant, think about how to utilize this time to expand your reach and to do things that you otherwise would not be able to do in a creative way that helps to set you apart.
I'll jump in with a few points of admissions advice as well. I would suggest don't overlook whatever campus you're looking at, because the reality is we don't go to all of the law schools that you're probably considering. But reaching out to the Black Law Students Association or any other cultural affinity group, they likely have an admissions committee and admissions committee co-chairs who are literally there to just talk to students who are interested in applying to their schools or who need a little bit of assistance throughout the process. So I would suggest reaching out to them. I would also, echo everything that's been said about just being proactive and reaching out to people and talking to people. But also, I'm going to be the one to say, relax and breathe, because I am certainly the type of person to be like, I'm not going to get into law school, or this is not going to work out, or whatever. And, throw in a pandemic and throw in all of the civil unrest and, police brutality and everything that's just happening in our world. And it can feel very, very overwhelming. So to relax as well, because chances are it will work out for you. And finally, I'm always a plug. Don't be afraid to take time off before law school. I think especially in communities of color, especially as coming from an immigrant family, there's the idea that if you take time off after college, you're not going to go back to school. But a lot of those years, in some cases that may be the case. But it works out either way, because if you take time off and you realize that you didn't want to go to law school, that is only positive. That's a plus for you. Or you take time off and you realize that you do want to go to law school and you got work experience, and maybe that reignites your passion for wanting to go to law school. Maybe that is a benefit because maybe you didn't have strong recommendations, but now you can have a work recommendation, a professional recommendation. So there are a whole number of benefits to taking time off from law school, and not necessarily, working at a law firm or, just use that time, because once you go to law school, you come out and we're just working away for ever. And so I really am always a proponent of taking time off, because it can only help you. I didn't really talk about like, you know, all of the other things that I do with my blog and things like that, but I'm also an advocate of doing the things that still make you happy. You don't have to be a conventional law student. So whatever your passions are outside of school or outside of your career, still pursue those as well. And I'm always happy to talk about those things that I do as well.
With that, that concludes our panel. We want to thank everybody for joining us for this past hour, as well as for all the panelists sharing their experience and expertise on a lot of the questions we had. The recording of this panel will be available on YouTube. The same link you used to view this, just click on that same link. It'll take you to YouTube. And on top of that, next Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern time will be our business and finance panel. So tune in for that. But otherwise, thank everybody so much for joining. And we're hopeful that you were able to learn from this experience.